Hi, my name's Claire Childs and I'm a lecturer in English Language and Linguistics at the University of York. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the issue of standardness in relation to the use of never in British English dialects. So, how standard do you find this sentence? I never organised it. How about in the following two contexts? So, context 1. Speaker A asks, didn't your school used to organise a sixth form party every year? Speaker B says, yes, but I never organised it. And context 2, Speaker A says, you were in charge of organising last year's sixth form party, weren't you? And Speaker B says, I never organised it, which could also be said as, I never organised it last year. Now, in context 1, it's quite clear that this is a very standard prototypical use of never. On every occasion that there was a sixth form party, they did not organise it. In context 2, the same reading could be true. So Speaker B might be saying that every time there's been a sixth form party, they haven't actually organised it. However, they might actually be referring just to last year's sixth form party as is presented in the context from Speaker A. So they might be saying, I never organised it, meaning just last year's. And this type of never is being classified as non-standard because it's referring to a single event rather than a series of events over time or possible opportunities for events. So this last example, we can force that interpretation where it refers only to last year's party by using the term last year. So by saying I never organised it last year, it makes it extra clear that they are referring only to one event. So these are two different uses of never. And we'll see the three main types here. So type 1 is the kind that we saw in the first example, which has been called a universal quantifier in the linguistic literature. And this is a term that you needn't necessarily worry about. It just means that it refers to possible events over a period of time. So its equivalent is not ever or not on any occasion. So we have the original example there. And this use originated in Old English, but of course it's still used today. The type 2 kind is what's been called a window of opportunity use. And in this occasion, it means not rather than not ever. So it refers to a single instant event, which in the linguistic literature we can call an achievement, that could have taken place in a specific window of opportunity but didn't actually happen. So an example of this case would be, I waited in for the postman but he never arrived. And this use has been found around the 17th century onwards. Type 3 is what we can call a generic negator. It's similar to type 2 in that it means not, but it's different in that it has a much wider distribution. So it's non-standard, it has no inherent time reference, and it can be used with any state or event, not just achievements, unlike type 2, which was limited to achievements. So the example for type 3 was that last one where the speaker B was referring to last year's party only, not a series of parties that have occurred every year over a period of time. So this use of never is found from the mid-19th century onwards. And so never has developed these functions, type 2 and type 3, from the original type 1. And type 3 is said to have been a direct development from type 2. So we can consider this a trajectory of diachronic language change, that is, change over time. So we talked about achievements previously, And I'll explain a little bit about what achievements are and how they compare to other predicate types, other sentence types basically. And in the literature, this is sometimes called lexical aspect. It's basically about the properties of different verbs and possible complements that they take. So we can categorize them into different kinds of states or events. So the first kind is the stative, which is a constant state, and these are examples such as have, need, or want. Having something persists over time, but doesn't have an inherent time boundary. So in effect, having something can persist indefinitely. Activities, on the other hand, are events, so they're more dynamic actions that happen. They occur over an unbounded time period, so examples would be walk, swim, or read. These are events that persist over time, but they don't have an inherent time boundary. So again, within reason, you could walk, swim, read for an indefinite period of time. Accomplishments are similar to activities in that they have an activity element to them, but they also have a completion phase. So the event itself is completed within a specific time frame. So examples include painting a picture, watching a program, or building something, where you have activities, painting, watching, and building, but the parts that follow, painting a picture, watching a program, building something, make it clear that there is an endpoint to that action. And lastly, we have achievements. These are instant dynamic events. So they are examples such as ask, take, go, and hit. These are events, they don't persist over time, but they do have an inherent time boundary. And what we mean by that is that the start and end point of the event is effectively happening at the same point. It happens so quickly and instantaneously that we can see it as having a boundary, but it's just so quick that it doesn't proceed over any length of time. So with this background, my question was, to what extent does variation in the use of never in present-day British English dialects reflect its historical development from this not ever to these different not uses in the type 2 and the type 3 cases? So to do this, I used a sample of speakers from 3 regional archives of casual speech from corpora in Glasgow, Tyneside and Salford, the sounds of the city corpus, the diachronic electronic corpus of Tyneside English, and the research on Salford English corpus. So to conduct this analysis, I used the notion of the linguistic variable, and this is very commonly used in sociolinguistic work. What this is a set of linguistic forms that mean the same thing. So in my case, the variable was consisting of 2 variants, never and didn't, in past tense contexts and in type 2 and type 3 contexts in particular. And this is because type 2 and type 3 uses of never are the ones that just mean not, so they don't have the not ever meaning. Extracted instances of never and didn't from the data, and then used what's called a decision tree to categorize each one. And you see an image of that just here. Full details are in the paper if you'd like to read more about it. But it's basically just to show that when we take an example sentence, we can ask questions of that sentence to determine whether it's a type 1, type 2, or type 3 use. So the questions that we ask are based on properties that we know hold for the different uses. And this is really important to ensure systematicity in how we code the data, how we categorize the data. I then compared the percentage frequency of each variant in the type 2 versus type 3 context in order to address the research question of whether the newer usage, the type 3, was influenced by its older origins in the type 2. So the first set of results concerns dialect differences. And we can see here a graph showing the frequency of never versus didn't in type 2 and type 3 contexts. And overall, we can see higher rates of never as opposed to didn't in type 2 contexts as opposed to type 3. So remember that type 2 is the window of opportunity use, as in I waited in for the engineer but he never arrived. Type 3 is the non-standard use, like I never organised that party last year. So the higher use of never among type 2 contexts as opposed to type 3 is perhaps not so surprising, because generally type 2 constructions are considered more standard, more acceptable, more accepted in standard English, whereas type 3 contexts, those are more marked, considered non-standard, perhaps more salient and noticeable in comparison. So people might tend to avoid use of stigmatized forms, but also it varies on an individual level, as well as by dialect, as we see here. The highest rates of never overall are in Glasgow for both contexts. And this is reminiscent of what Miller reported, where he said that never was the normal negative with past tense verbs in Scots. Now, it might be that my data is perhaps less vernacular than Miller's data is, but even so, we still see that difference where the Scottish locality is showing much higher rates of never overall compared to the two Northern English communities. In terms of lexical aspects, or the different kinds of verbs that we saw earlier, we can see this hierarchy where the use of never in type 3 contexts, the non-standard ones, are affected by whether there is an inherent time boundary. So the highest rates of never are reserved for achievements, followed by accomplishments, then activities, and then lastly statives. So we can see an immediate parallel where type 2 never is restricted to achievements, and we see that restriction manifests itself in the use of the type 3 as well, but now just as in a probabilistic way, i.e. 15.6% rate of never among achievements, and that's the highest of any category. But also we note that accomplishments are the second in the ranking of the percentages here. And remember that achievements and accomplishments are the only two of those four categories that have an inherent time boundary. Activities can run indefinitely, statives can also run indefinitely. So we see this effect of older uses of a form influencing its newer uses. So in answer to the question, is never standard or non-standard, the answer is it depends. It varies according to lots of different factors, including dialect, lexical aspect, and discourse context. Just those first two scenarios I showed you were a really nice illustration of how sometimes a single word or phrase can be ambiguous, but the context can help you disambiguate it. And we were able to disambiguate between a type 1 reading and a type 3 reading of I never organised the party by adding that little part in brackets, last year. So by saying I never organised the party last year, it makes it clear that that is a type 3 use of never. But beyond that, standardness in general is context dependent. And this is just one example. What someone thinks is natural, another speaker might find unnatural. It depends what dialect they speak, depends on their own idiolects or their own personal way of speaking. It might depend on education, things they were taught in school. And ultimately, standards are changing as well, and there can be disagreements even within standard English about whether something is standard English or not. So ultimately, as sociolinguists, we try not to be prescriptive about these matters, but be more descriptive, so describe how people actually use language rather than saying this is right, this is wrong, for instance. So this research comes from my paper that was published in the Journal of Linguistics, and I've got 2 links here which take you to the full version in case you'd like to check any details. Thank you very much.